Hello, and welcome to another edition of Atheists Speak Up. Our guest this evening is Lynn Zanger, and we will discuss a project he has been involved with for the past 3 years. That project is a summer camp named Camp Quest. Lynn was raised here in Michigan and is a design engineer for an automotive supplier. He also has a background in art and music and studied for a career in education before turning to engineering. He has had various experiences within and outside of Cub Scouts and has, for the past 3 years, been part of the staff at Camp Quest in Ohio, and until this year was on their board of directors. Lynn and his wife celebrated 20 years together recently, and they have an 11-year-old son. Lynn, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Jason.
Lynn, first of all, what is Camp Quest?
Jason, Camp Quest is the first residential summer camp in the history of the United States for the children of humanists, freethinkers, agnostics, atheists, or however people want to describe themselves. This is a week-long, 8-day sleepaway camp that is really very traditional in every way, with that one exception.
So what makes Camp Quest different from other summer camps that don't focus on religion?
Jason, that essentially is the difference. Most summer camps are either operated by a church or other religious organizations, or they're operated by organizations that require a belief in a God before you can be a member.
You're referring to the Boy Scouts, am I right?
That's absolutely correct. Camp Quest was founded largely as a response to the Boy Scouts' policy of requiring a declaration of religious belief and expelling those who refused or who came out of the closet as non-believers. The founder of Camp Quest, Edwin Kagan, happens to be an Eagle Scout, and he is also the Kentucky State Director for American Atheists, and he is American Atheist National Legal Director. Camp Quest celebrated its 10-year anniversary in June of 2005 and has inspired the creation of other Camp Quests around the country.
And our discussion this evening is
opening a Camp Quest here in Michigan. 3 years ago, my wife and I were looking for a summer camp for our son. Friends of ours and his teacher recommended what turned out to be one of the largest Bible-thumping summer camps in the state. When we visited that camp with our friends, I was really quite stunned at the level of religious indoctrination and obviously decided to keep on looking. Eventually, I stumbled onto Camp Quest during an internet search.
So why not send your son to that Camp Quest?
Well, the original Camp Quest, which we now call Camp Quest Classic, is held at a leased campsite near Cincinnati. For us, that's a 5-hour drive, which I thought was a bit much. It also happened to be scheduled during the last week of school. Our elementary school happens to have an extended school year, and I really didn't want to take my son out of school. So I sent Edwin an email asking for more information about Camp Quest and asked him if he had any plans to expand into Michigan. He replied saying no, but that if I were interested, I could start my own.
That sounds like a challenge.
At the time, I didn't see it so much as a challenge as an opportunity. As I've gotten to know Edwin better, I've come to realize that he really does challenge people, not to provoke them, but to get them to act, to get them to participate. I was tired of negative activism like protests, as in the last few years of the Vietnam War, and I'm giving away my age here. I just wanted to do something positive. The idea of a secular summer camp hit me as the perfect means of positively expressing non-belief without being political at the same time.
Mm-hmm. So tell us about Camp Quest of Michigan.
Well, Camp Quest of Michigan was founded as an independent, nonprofit corporation in March of 2003. Of course, we got permission to use the name. And at the same time agreed to generally follow the program and the idea of the camp. I brought Edwin Kagan to Okemos for a presentation on Camp Quest in March of 2003, and invited members of the largest free thought, humanist, atheist groups in Michigan, plus whoever else was interested in this project. I estimated the level of interest would be pretty high before I jumped into it, And the Okemos meeting really exceeded my expectations.
That's great.
Yeah. At that meeting, not only did Edwin give an outstanding presentation on Camp Quest, but we also announced that we had found a wonderful campsite here in Michigan and would be starting a Camp Quest locally. We've had some ups and downs since then, but now we have both the startup money and the people together and are now enrolling campers for August of this year. I do want to interject, too, that our startup money is thanks to an educational grant from the Institute for Human Studies in New York, and we're exceedingly grateful to them for that support.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what goes on at Camp Quest? You said this is a camp for atheist kids. Now, do you teach campers about atheism the same way that other camps teach about Jesus?
Absolutely not. And not only do we invite godless kids, but all children are welcome to enroll. But I'm not sure that it's possible to teach someone to be an atheist. It's certainly not our purpose to turn campers into good card-carrying little atheists. Atheism is a conclusion a person comes to after many, many years of careful thought, and it is certainly not a belief. I also want to make clear that we do not want to involve our campers in some sort of so-called culture war. Many campers have experienced hostility from their classmates because they don't follow the popular superstitions. At Camp Quest, they learn, sometimes for the first time, that it's okay to not believe in a God. They also meet other campers with similar experiences and learn that they are not alone. They learn that non-belief is widespread and that U.S. history is full of illustrious freethinkers, skeptics, and non-believers. They just don't learn that in school.
So is Camp Quest of Michigan a school as well?
Not really, although our underlying purpose is educational. Our program activities include critical thinking challenges.
Oh, no, critical thinking challenge. Now, can you give me an example of critical thinking challenge you would do at Camp Quest?
Well, our traditional critical thinking challenge that we present to campers each year involves the two invisible unicorns that live at Camp Quest. Now, these two invisible unicorns, obviously you can't see them because they're invisible. Mm-hmm. But you can't touch them, hear them. They don't leave a mark. They don't eat anything. You can walk right through them. And any camper who can prove that they are not there receives a godless $100 bill. And this is the, so far, unclaimed prize. And as you can see, there is no religious graffiti on the back. This was printed prior to 1957. Now, our other critical thinking activities include code breaking, formal logic. We also have civics, a little history, quite a bit of science, including an introduction to evolution. But we try to design the activities so that campers participate, not just sit and listen. One of the benefits of doing this at a summer camp is that campers get to collect specimens and then study them under a microscope, or actually see the planets through a telescope, or to work with other campers on challenges given to them at the beginning of camp. We've done model rocketry. We've created a scale model of the solar system that covered several acres. And we've measured out the proportions of Noah's Ark to see if it really is reasonable to believe that all those animals could fit into that little box and live there for a year.
What about the fun stuff?
Well, Jason, it's all fun stuff. When kids get to participate, they take a greater interest in what's presented. But we certainly don't neglect things like swimming and canoeing and hiking and crafts. Our host camp also operates its own riding stable, so campers will also have the opportunity to go horseback riding. Our host camp also has certified staff supervising the archery range and the climbing tower and all waterfront activities, and provides lifeguards for the waterfront activities and the indoor pool. And we don't forget the campfires and the s'mores.
That's very important.
That is important. It's a rule. It's a rule. You have to have s'mores at summer camp.
That's right. That's right.
Yes. Camp Quest is a co-ed summer camp for children from age 8 to 17. We have separate sleeping for boys, and we have separate sleeping quarters for boys and girls, of course, and at least 2 counselors in each cabin. We have a high staff ratio of about 1 counselor for every 2 campers. This is so we can better look out for the campers' safety and to make sure campers are always engaged in some sort of activity. We also want as many positive role models for these kids as possible, and really have to balance that policy with the expense of bringing all these volunteers to camp. All the staff are volunteers. No one gets paid. Most come back year after year from all over the country. Our camp will have experienced counselors from Camp Quest Classic, plus some new faces. But all staff provide references, and we do a national criminal background check on all staff.
Now, what's the campground like?
Well, we are leasing a portion of one of the finest YMCA facilities in the state. We'll have this particular campground to ourselves. It's relatively secluded from other campgrounds in the complex. Has ample separate shower and toilet facilities for boys and girls, and has its own dining hall and activity hall. Campers sleep in bunks, and rather than a traditional campsite, this particular campsite has yurts. Now, yurts are a sort of a large round tent over a rigid framework. These are very roomy, have great ventilation, and these even have skylights and carpeting. Our host camp also provides us with food service. All meals are included, and is not your usual camp food. Their menu is designed by their own dietitian and is really far better than most public school lunch programs. Special diets, including vegetarian diets, are not a problem.
That's great. Now, can campers sign up now?
Absolutely. I strongly encourage parents to register their campers as soon as possible. We have a limited number of bunks and can only accept 40 campers. Camp Quest of Michigan is scheduled for Sunday, August 13th to Sunday, August 20th. We'll be at the Sherman Lake YMCA Outdoor Center in Augusta, which is between Battle Creek and Kalamazoo. The camper fee includes everything. Campers simply have to provide their own bedding, clothes, and personal items. In addition to the all-inclusive price, campers receive a T-shirt every year, and we design a new T-shirt every year. And if I could show this without fouling my microphone.
Maybe if I hold it.
Yeah, okay.
That might help.
Now,
there you go.
Yes. Now this has our Camp Quest name, obviously, and our motto, it's Beyond Belief, and the year, this is the 2005 T-shirt, CQMMV in Roman numerals, current era. This doodling here, this is Morse code, dash, dot, dash, dot, dash, dash, dot, dash. That stands for CQ, which is also international code for does anyone want to talk? And we do quite a bit of talking at Camp Quest. And this is the back of the T-shirt, Camp Quest X, 1996 to 2005. It's our anniversary year. And the theme for 2005 was "What have we learned?" We have a different theme every year.
Right.
And this is our logo.
Okay.
Yes.
Very interesting.
Yes. And it comes in a different color every year, and we have a different theme every year. And it's really quite a collector's item.
That's great.
Yes.
That's great. Now, what about parents who maybe cannot afford to send their children to camp? Do you have any way to assist them?
Jason, we've been very fortunate to have several very generous people provide the means for us to offer a limited number of camperships. All information regarding our camperships will be handled with the strictest confidence.
How can people contact you?
Well, people can contact Camp Quest of Michigan by email at campquest-mi@comcast.net, or by going to our website at michigan.camp-quest.com, or by writing to Camp Quest of Michigan, P.O. Box 656, Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, 48304.
Fantastic. Lynn, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Next up, we have Greg Reich speaking about David Barton.
I really do want to get Greg up here. I know he's got volumes that he wants to tell you. You've met Greg as one of our State Board of Directors. You also saw Greg 3 years ago when he debated Gary Glenn, President of the American Family Association, on religion and government, and he did an admirable job. Greg has a very special skill for research and serves as the political and analytical advisor for me, the state director, and also is a resource aid for me as the state director. And Greg is a scholar in his very own right, and he's very busy researching. He spent an enormous amount of time researching David Barton, and he's in the process of writing a book on David Barton, and we want to wish him success in that. And as you know, David Barton is a Texas-based propagandist who attacks separation of state and church and lies, has all kinds of errors and misquotes in his books, and but he is seen by me and by Greg and by many atheists as one of the most dangerous advocates for the establishment of theocracy in America. And so Greg is going to give us some hard-punching facts and a good speech about David Barton. Please welcome Greg Reich.
My fellow atheists, I welcome this break from the putrid swamp of lies that has been the subject of my research for the past several months. I knew going into this that I would become bogged down in the muck and mire of David Barton's dishonesty, but I had no idea how deep I would have to wade to get to the truth. For those of you who do not know Barton, he is currently the vice chairman of the Texas Republican Committee. In the past 2 presidential elections, he worked on the Bush campaign. He currently gives what he calls spirit tours of Washington, D.C., where he attempts to demonstrate that our nation's capital is chock full of Christianity. He's also an author of several books of revisionist history. These books remain popular among Christian evangelicals. More importantly, his material surfaces often among the words of politicians, ministers, journalists, and facilitators of internet chain letters. Quite often, the credit does not go to David Barton, but it all can be traced back to him if you know where to look. David Barton's bio on wallbuilders.com lists 2 degrees and his numerous awards. His primary degree is a Bachelor of Arts from Oral Roberts University in religious education, not history. I laughed too, Frank. His other degree is an honorary doctorate of letters from Pensacola Christian College, a fundamentalist school. As for his awards, he claims to have won the Daughters of the American Revolution's highest honor, which his bio names as a George Washington Honor Medal. There's no such award from the Daughters of the American Revolution. When I investigated it, a representative from their Office of Historian General informed me that their organization had never even heard of David Barton, and they have no award on record. Now, recently I found out a year for this alleged award, and it's 1998, and I emailed the people from Daughters of the American Revolution. I'm going to find out. What I've been finding, and as I'll say in a second, his awards tend not to be for history. So I want to know what he won it for, if he indeed won it. It turns out that David Barton did win a George Washington Honor Medal, but it was the Freedoms Foundation at Valley Forge, an organization which has a tendency to award political conservatives more often than not, that awarded him the award. However, the officer I spoke with informed me that Barton was not a distinguished recipient. Additionally, his award was not for scholarship in history, but for promotion of morality, whatever that means. The other awards David Barton received were all for media production and for gospel music, not history. With no degree in history, no awards for work in the field, and no other discernible credentials, it seems that Barton is nothing more than an amateur historian. He's a self-published author who has become popular because he tells Christians what they want to hear, that the separation of church and state is a myth. The United States has been a Christian nation since it began. And the ban of prayer in schools caused the moral decline of this country. This last assertion will be the focus of my speech today. As Arlene mentioned, I am currently writing a book on David Barton. The working title is Why David Barton Matters: The Undue Influence of an Amateur Historian on Politics in America. In it, I include his political ties, his involvement with Christian extremists, and my refutations to the arguments made in his several publications. Through the course of my research, I ran across a book entitled America, to Pray or Not to Pray. It became a chapter in and of itself, and I want to tell you about this book. Come with me, if you will, on a journey into the fantasy of a Christian historical revisionist. The journey begins, like the movie The Blues Brothers, with a mission from God. Barton claims that in July of 1987, his God told him to do two things. First, find the date when the Supreme Court had first prohibited prayer in schools, and review SAT scores over several decades. What he found was nothing short of astonishing to him. From 1952 through 1962, the SAT scores, according to Barton, remained relatively stable. However, they dropped dramatically from 1962 through 1980. He also found out that mandatory verbal prayer had been banned from school through court decisions in 1962 and 1963. Amazing coincidence, right? An unnamed congressman apparently thought so. He tells Barton that prayer in the schools had always been considered a religious issue. He had never been approached from a statistical standpoint. This congressman proclaimed, someone should research this. The congressman, of course, could not be reached for comment because Barton has chosen to keep him anonymous. He's probably from Texas, though. That's my guess. As anyone with a critical mind might guess, there's more to the SAT story than Barton has told to our nameless congressman. I'll get to that in a moment. Barton's God spoke to him again through his secretary, who outlined the strategy for demonstrating that prohibiting mandatory prayer in schools has led to the moral decline of the United States. She took the Regent's Prayer, the mandatory daily recitation of which had been prohibited through the Engel v. Vitale decision in 1962, and broke it down. The prayer goes, Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. Now listen for the distinction. Listen to how it becomes a little bit more general. The secretary, who is as anonymous as the congressman, quote, observed that probably all four of the areas mentioned in the Regent's Prayer, students, families, schools, and the nation, had declined dramatically since 1962. I will address Barton's notion of moral decline, and whether one may claim that the United States could be said to have had one beginning in 1962. I will talk about his misleading historical background on the original intent of the Founding Fathers, and indeed on the validity of the very notion of original intent. I will talk about his claims concerning students, families, schools, and the country. Finally, I will talk about David Barton's plan of action to insert religion into public affairs. Let's go back to David Barton's mission from God. Remember that he made the claim that the decline of SAT scores coincided with the Supreme Court decision in Engel v. Vitale in 1962. It is true that there was a dramatic decline in SAT scores after 1962. It is also true that the scores remained relatively stable from 1952 through 1962. What Barton leaves out is that there was also a dramatic decline in scores from 1941 to 1952. He also conveniently omits any historical frame of reference for the SAT itself. The reason there is a decline from 1941 through 1952 involved a shift in the socioeconomic backgrounds of students taking the test. Up until 1941, only Ivy League schools and a handful of prestigious northern universities used the SAT as basis for admission, 41 schools in total. From 1941 through 1952, the number of schools using the test jumped from 41 to 350, with the most additional schools located in the West and South, where communities were more rural, secondary schools received less funding, and farming was still more important than professions requiring degrees. The scores remained relatively stable after 1952 until the test went into universal use in 1962. Unfortunately, there hasn't been readily accessible serious inquiry into the reasons behind the dramatic decline of SAT scores from 1962 through 1980, other than the mention of the universal use of the test, which predictably would lower the scores. However, if we put the period into historical context, then cross-reference what we know with statistics, we can discover the not-so-mystical reasons behind the decline. First, in the period between 1962 and 1980, the number of students taking the test rose nearly to the number of students who could take the test. In other words, students of all socioeconomic backgrounds were taking the test, especially as college became more accessible through scholarships and the opening of more state universities across the country. A large influx of students whose parents were not as well educated as the parents of students who took the test prior to 1962 began to take the SAT, predictably lowering the scores since children of educated parents performed better academically overall. Next, military action in Vietnam was ongoing and escalated for more than half of this period. The draft, which began in 1951, began to draw an increasing number of young people into military service. In 1962, the real buildup of troops began with committal of 5,000 troops to the conflict. In 1965, with the level of military action rising, the first draft cards were burned in protest publicly. Young people whose families had the means entered college to avoid the draft, meaning that an even wider variety of people from different socioeconomic backgrounds were taking the SAT. The Statistical Abstract of the United States bears out this rationale, showing a dramatic increase in the number of newly enrolled students over this period. Finally, we come to the baby boomer generation. This generation includes all babies born from 1946 to 1964. The first of this generation would have been taking the test in their junior or senior years, around 1962 or 1963. As this generation began to make its way through school, student-teacher ratios experienced a dramatic shift. Less teachers per student meant less individual attention. Also, funding did not catch up with the number of students entering the system for the length of the period between 1962 and 1980. Though Barton notes that SAT scores began to rise after 1980, he points to the increasing number of students entering religious and private schools as the reason. He does not take into account the fact that the last of the baby boomer generation was getting close to high school graduation, and so the number of average students per classroom was decreasing. Interestingly, Barton also argues that the students that were going to private schools had no particular advantage over the public school students, that economics was not an indicator of performance on the SAT, and it's pretty amazing that he goes into that. So David Barton's premise of a connection between prohibition of mandatory prayer and declining SAT scores is quite flawed. It is certain that Barton never intended for this book, or indeed any of his publications, to fall in the hands of a critical reader. A critical reader might look for other reasons why SAT scores might decline. The same reader might also be tempted to look back through history for evidence of this moral decline of which Barton speaks. The assertion that the United States went through a moral decline beginning in 1962 begs two questions. Just what is morality? And was this country more or less moral prior to 1962? For the definition of morality, I turn to the dictionary, rather than consume a great deal of time with a philosophical debate. Dictionary.com lists 4 definitions for morality, all of which imply an arbitrary standard of what is right, good, and virtuous. The second definition links morality directly to religion. It gives the definition as a system of ideas of right and wrong conduct, followed by the examples, religious morality, Christian morality. Armed with this definition, we can safely say that morality depends on one's own interpretation of what is right and what is wrong, and possibly how people in general interpret these concepts. In other words, morality is arbitrary and culturally relative. That being the case, I'm going to throw out a few examples of things I think were wrong throughout history prior to 1962, because apparently David Barton thinks all was right with the world, or at least this country, prior to that year. First, let's consider racial segregation. State-sanctioned segregation was outlawed under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So prior to that year, segregation wasn't accepted in legal practice. Discrimination based on one's skin color, to me, is wrong. Apparently, David Barton does not consider it immoral. Next, let's talk about slavery. It's not surprising that David Barton would overlook slavery. After all, his Bible does not condemn it in any way. In fact, it gives rules on how to treat slaves, how to sell them, how much male slaves are worth compared with female slaves, penalties for beating one slave, which brings me to one of my favorite rules from the Old Testament. If a person would beat a slave to death outright, that person would be punished. However, if the slave continued to live for a day or two, the master would not be punished. I quote, "For he is his money." Bearing this passage from Exodus in mind, it is not surprising that someone who believes in the infallibility of the Bible, or at least someone who associates heavily with and is supported by those who do, would not worry too much about slavery. Reviewing history further, we come to the status of women. Women did not receive the right to vote until 1920. The Constitution did not consider the rights of women. Legal decisions concerning women's issues were all made by men. Essentially, women were treated as the property of their fathers and husbands in this country because they had no rights under the law. Free black men were considered 3/5 of a person. Women were not even considered. I consider this notion to be quite wrong, but again, someone who believes in biblical infallibility would disagree with me. In several places in the Bible, women are exactly half of what men are. Female slaves are worth half the value of male slaves. When women give birth to males, they were considered unclean for exactly half the time they were considered unclean for giving birth to females. Elsewhere, wives are told to submit to their husbands. It goes on, but it's no wonder David Barton has no problem with women submitting to the whims of male voters prior to 1920. Let's not forget the slaughter of the indigenous tribes throughout the colonial period and during the subsequent annexation of Native American lands after this country formed. The United States government broke treaty after treaty with the Native Americans as well. To this day, Native Americans have it worse on average than any other minority group, even with those tribes with successful casinos thrown in. Again, Barton takes a true biblical stance on this issue and has no moral dilemma where the slaughter of non-Christians is concerned. Let's consider what a good friend of Barton's, Pat Robertson, says about slaughter of the pagan people in the land of Canaan. God told the Israelites to kill them all, men, women, and children, to destroy them. And that seems like a terrible thing to do. Is it or isn't it? Well, let us assume that there were 2,000 of them or 10,000 of them living in the land, or whatever number. I don't have the exact number, but pick a number. And God said, kill them all. Well, that would seem hard, wouldn't it? But that would be 10,000 people who would probably go to hell. But if they stayed and reproduced in 30, 40, or 50, or 60, or 100 more years, there could conceivably be 10,000. Would grow to 100. 100,000 conceivably would grow to 1,000,000. And there would be 1,000,000 people who would have to spend an eternity in hell. And it is far more merciful to take away a few than to see in the future, 100 years down the road, and say, well, I'll have to take away 1,000,000 people that will be forever apart from God because he is an abomination, because the abomination is there. It's like a contagion. God saw that there was no cure for it. It wasn't going to change, and all they would do is cause trouble for the Israelites and pull the Israelites away from God and prevent the truth of God from reaching the earth. And so God in love, and that was a loving thing, took away a small number of what he might not have to take away a large number. Finally, let's look at the question of prayer in schools itself from a historical context. For David Barton's premise to have any shred of validity left, mandatory prayer would have to have been a general practice prior to 1962. However, it is simply not the case. The major players in public education in the 1800s saw prayer and Bible recitation in schools as a source of conflict, and advocated strongly for the general prohibition of the practice. President Theodore Roosevelt was quite critical of the practice as well. Also, Catholics and Protestants work to keep their conflicting dogmas out of the public schools, each fearing the superiority of the other. When prayer and Bible recitation were included, violence was the result. The American Atheist website has the full transcript of a radio address where Madalyn Murray O'Hara discusses the violent persecution of Irish Catholics after a Catholic student was excused from recitation of verses from the King James Bible. It is a conflict that raged for over a decade in the mid-1800s, including several armed skirmishes, churches burnt to the ground, people tarred, feathered, and ridden around town on rails. Apparently, Barton has no problem with such conflicts. In any case, for the most part, prayer and Bible recitation were not common practice throughout the country for most of our history, though many schools did practice it and continue to do so in spite of the law or potential conflicts between religious sects. Barton appears to think that all Christians are the same, that, first of all, he says 97% of the country is Christian, and essentially he thinks that everybody is the same kind of Christian he is, and it's just amazing. With David Barton's premise refuted, it seems there is no reason to continue on with the rest of the book. However, in the course of my research, I have found that there are so many quotes that are not connected with the basic premises of his publication that it is worthwhile to take a look at everything and come up with a way of recognizing a David Barton tactic, refuting it from the standpoint of calling Barton's credibility into question. One such tactic is to distort history of the Constitution and the Founding Fathers. Barton makes a big deal about the Founding Fathers and quotes from the Founding Fathers. Now, 3 years ago, when I had my debate with Gary Glenn, Gary kept coming up with Founding Father quote after Founding Father quote. And my response to that was that the Founding Fathers deemed it necessary only to give rights to people who were white, male property owners over the age of 21. So I think we've moved on from there. But it's interesting to look at the Founding Father quotes, especially the way he uses them, because he'll quote Madison. Now, this is an example of the things he does. He quoted Madison as saying that Christianity is the greatest religion in the world. Well, Madison said that in a document where he went on to talk about separation of church and state. And if you read the whole article, or the whole letter that he wrote, you get the impression that his saying that Christianity was the greatest nation, or greatest religion in the world, I think I said nation, Christianity was the greatest religion in the world, was basically satirical. I think he was being sarcastic. Madison on original intent is very interesting as well. I read a book by a historian on original intent, and Madison thought original intent was just a bogus concept because he knew that nobody would know what happened at the Constitutional Convention, and he purposely withheld his notes on the Constitutional Convention, his extensive documentation, because he wanted the states to see the text that came out of it, because he knew the danger of people quoting someone who disagreed with this or that principle, such as Patrick Henry, who Barton quotes extensively. Patrick Henry was anti-federalist. He wanted states' rights to be strong. He didn't want a strong federal government, and Barton quotes him over and over as someone who expresses the opinions of all of the Founding Fathers. And what's interesting is there are enough Patrick Henry quotes that he doesn't have to make any up, but he ended up doing it anyway. He has a list of 12 questionable quotes. That's what his pamphlet was called. They're actually completely fallacious quotes. They never existed in any of the writings or any of the speeches of the Founding Fathers he quotes. But Michigan Atheist website has that document on the 12 questionable quotes. It's interesting to keep those in mind when you're debating with people. Although my argument is, be careful of using quotes from the Founding Fathers, because really their original intent is not important, at least to Madison, because everything wasn't unanimous. And to say that this or that quote says it all the Founding Fathers believe this, is eliminating the debate from the issues. And so, he could pull up any quote he wants. But listen to what he does with Noah Webster. Noah Webster had a profound conversion experience in the early 1800s. He was not a Christian in the sense of hellfire and brimstone until well after the Constitutional Convention. And before the Constitutional Convention, he spoke about separation of state and church extensively. But when it came to all of his publications after his conversion experience, he of course wanted to incorporate religion and public life, and Barton quotes only from that era. He doesn't quote anything from Noah Webster before 1810. And I already talked about him quoting Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry is, he was a religious guy, and he was an anti-federalist, and really his opinion was often the minority opinion. Now, he also says that in 1962, the Supreme Court reinterpreted separation of church and state, the whole concept of it. He claims that separation of church and state meant that, the wall of separation was that there would be no national denomination, and that the government wouldn't interfere with a church, but a church could interfere with the state. A church could be involved politically with the state, which is just, ludicrous. It comes up with all kinds of conflicts. And if you look at what the Founding Fathers said, it doesn't go with what Barton thinks of his original intent, because the Founding Fathers pretty much included Jews and Muslims and all kinds of religions in their writings, and not just denominations. But he says that the Supreme Court never considered any First Amendment cases regarding separation of church and state before 1962, and that's completely false. One of the reasons that a whole lot of Supreme Court cases involving the Establishment Clause did not come up prior to 1962, or actually, I should say prior to 1948, really. So in 1947, the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment applied the Bill of Rights to every state, and so they end up with a lot of First Amendment issues because the states were passing laws that took the Bill of Rights away, the rights outlined in the Bill of Rights away. And in 1948, there was a ruling on tax-supported religious programs in the schools. Now, in his book, Barton goes into problems involving students, families, schools in the country. Now, the problems involving students include the abstinence education and the prohibition of it. He says that Kendrick versus Brown outlawed abstinence education in the schools. That's simply false. He even quotes the case. He quotes a paragraph from the case in his book. And if I ended up going and looking at the case, knowing that David Barton will take a quote and ignore the rest of the document, and the case is actually involving a program where a church was actually having tax money dedicated to their program in the public school. And they were teaching abstinence-only education as part of that program. So David Barton focuses on this one aspect of the program and says that abstinence education was abolished, and ignores the fact that tax money was going toward religion. What's also interesting is that this case was prior to 1962. So his argument fails there also. Now, teen pregnancies and STDs are something that he brings up as evidence of the moral decline of the United States. However, wherever abstinence education has been introduced, the rate of teen pregnancies and sexually transmitted diseases has actually risen. So to say that abstinence education is something that needs to be put back into schools because we need to stop some moral decline, it oversimplifies the reasons why these things were on the rise. He talks about families, he talks about divorce rates. Everything is simplistic. All of his explanations are it happened because prayer was taken out of the schools, and it's all related to this. He also says that it's not actually prayer. So this is what's weird about David Barton. In his preface to the book, he says that prayer in the schools is responsible. You know, if it was taken out of the schools, God was taken out of the schools, and that's responsible for all this moral decline. In the very next chapter of the book, he goes into an explanation that prayer in the schools is not actually the thing that's responsible, but it's an indication of a public policy that was taking God out of public life. So he changes the argument, he shifts the argument. Now, one of the things about the moral decline of the country, I already talked about the schools, because the schools, basically, it's all about the SATs. The SATs are the big thing with the schools, and he ends up just reiterating everything in that chapter that he talked about in his preface. But as far as the country goes, one of the things that he brings up is violent crime. And his graph is actually accurate up to 1994. Embarrassingly enough for him, that was the year he published the book, and after that, violent crime decreased dramatically. So I guess he could come back and say it was because my book was published, but it was Clinton was president. You know how much they hate Clinton. Are we almost out of time? Thank you.
This is your State Board of Directors, people that I rely on. Terry Don, who is our Sergeant of Arms, is at the back door. Bradley St. Pierre has been an activist with Michigan Atheists probably for 2 decades. He does all of our literature, so he's handling the literature table. Bradley also coordinates our Darwin Day, which will be coming up in February. Lee Helms, I think Lee Helms has been with us almost the whole 30 years. Well, pretty close. And he is our Director of Communication. And Greg Reich. Greg Reich is the editor of our newsletter. He does almost all the research for me, especially the political research. And so I lean very heavy on Greg Reich. Jeff Souza is our webmaster, and we all know how important this web page is. And his wife Meg's not with him today, but she's also on the board. And Jason Glavis, we just added to the board because we want him on the board. He is the founder and director of the Greater Flint Atheists and Humanists. And Lois Brooks, who's been with us for mega years, several decades. She is our historian. And Henry, come here, sweetheart. When I said Michigan Atheists Affiliate Group is 30 years old, this is the man you need to thank for that. He hung in there for all those hard years before PCs, before, you have no idea what it was to communicate with even 10 atheists in Michigan when you had to do it by telephone and stuffing mail. Henry stayed in for the long haul. Oh, he wasn't always the director. He would get so weary, he would quit and somebody else would take over. And 6 or 7 months later, they didn't want the job anymore, and Henry would go back to it. We owe this 30 years to Henry Morgan. Okay, folks.
That will conclude our program for this evening. Again, I would like to thank Lynn Zanger for being here, and we hope to see you again next time.